Hello students! Last class we looked at the quadratic formula and how we could use it to solve quadratic equations. Today we're going to review the different methods we've learned for solving quadratic equations, and we're going to talk about when we should use each method. The very first method that we learned for solving quadratic equations was factoring. Now, one advantage of factoring is that it's very fast and very simple. If the polynomial can be factored, it usually doesn't take much work to do that, and we don't end up with pluses and minuses and square roots and all sorts of other things. Now, the reason we don't always use factoring, though, is because not all polynomials can be factored. So we can only use this method when we have a polynomial that can be factored. For example, in x squared plus 2x minus 15 equals 0, we can use unfoiling to factor that. And in 3y squared minus y equals 0, we can factor out a GCF and then use the zero factor property to set each factor equal to 0. In these situations, because those can be factored, we want to use factoring. It's going to be the simplest method. The next method we learned was the square root property. Now, an advantage of this is it works very nicely if we have an equation in a very particular form. If we have something like ax squared equals n, we can easily get the x squared alone and use the square root property. Or if we have an equation in the form something squared equals a number, again, we can easily take the square root of both sides. Now, a disadvantage of this is that if it's not in one of these two forms, we have to go through the process of completing the square, which is quite a pain. So in general, we're only going to use the square root property if we're in one of these special forms. For example, 3z squared equals 18, we can easily get the z squared alone by dividing by 3, and then we can use the square root property to solve. Similarly, with 3a minus 1 squared equals 4, we can take the square root of both sides and isolate a fairly easily. Now, the last method that we learned is the quadratic formula. An advantage of this is that it works with any quadratic equation. It doesn't matter if it's factorable, doesn't matter if we have a perfect trinomial square, this should always work. Now, the reason we don't always use it, though, is it requires a lot of calculations, which provide a lot of opportunities to make mistakes. Remember that we have that plus or minus symbol. We've got the square root, b squared minus 4ac. There's a lot of negatives involved, usually. And so there's so many places to make mistakes. And in fact, whenever I have a student who chooses to use the quadratic formula every single time, they tend to make a lot of unnecessary mistakes and get a lot of problems wrong. So we really only want to use this when we can't easily factor the polynomial and when it's not in one of these special forms where the square root property is easy. So for example, d squared plus 3d minus 11 equals 0. That can't be factored. We could try to use unfoiling, but there aren't two numbers that multiply to negative 11 and add up to 3. Similarly, for this other equation, if we subtracted 3 from both sides, we could try and use the AC method, but the AC method isn't going to work either. So only when factoring doesn't work, and when we don't have something in one of these nice forms, is it a good idea to use the quadratic formula. I hope at this point you understand how all three of these methods work, and you understand when we choose each of these methods. Remember, we use factoring when it's easily factorable. We use the square root property when it's in one of these special forms, and then we use the quadratic formula in any other situation. I'm not going to go through any examples in this video because if you click on the link below, there are several examples, and in each of those examples, you have to choose which method to use and then apply that method. I want you to go through those problems and get a lot of practice, because when the quadratic equation comes up on a test, you will not be told which method to use. It's not going to say, oh, solve this one by factoring, or oh, solve that one with the square root property. You have to make the decision yourself, and the best way to get good at that is to get practice.